I hope I've been very supportive of Scott. I think one of the things he's doing is making our organization reach out to the rest of the world. I teach 20th century world history at Montana Tech, and I've benefited from Scott's insights and Scott's clues as to what is going on in terms of United States foreign policy in Latin America. Maybe you were at Father Roy Bourgeois' talk here in Missoula. We had him over in Butte, and then we showed the video afterwards, hidden in plain sight, about the United States government's terrorist school at the School of the Americas in Columbus, Georgia. Scott has seen the impact of our ignorance on American foreign policy up close and personal in Central America and in Colombia. And so once again, I look forward to being informed by Scott. And once again, I admire his courage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, George, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. And thank you all very much for being here this afternoon. It was a very intense couple of months that I spent in Colombia this summer, and I just hope that my words and the images this afternoon will be able to do justice to the very amazing people that I was able to spend time with there. And what I'd like to do to start with is just a little bit of background in terms of Colombia, kind of set the context for the slides that I'll be showing. And let's see if I can, phobia about the technology here, but we'll kind of see how this goes. So, I mean, obviously we're here at the Montana Human Rights Network's conference, but it's a little bit in terms of how this kind of fits into our work. And again, that work being to defend democratic values, justice, equality, the right to participation, countering prejudice and discrimination. And we work on the full range of human rights, so in terms of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural human rights. And we've also been over the last few years working to develop relations with human rights organizations in other countries. And principally that's been in Colombia, and it's been within that context that I've been able to go there and do the work that I've been doing there. Let's click past that one. And I'm certainly very critical of U.S. foreign policy, but before I get into talking about all the things that I stand against, I want to be very clear about what I and what we stand for. And that's basically the idea that another world is possible. And that's the theme of the World Social Forum, which every year brings together individuals and organizations from around the world to talk about what is our vision for a better world. And that would be a world in which everyone has enough food, decent housing, health care, access to education, work with fair pay, and a clean environment. And oftentimes, those of us that are opposed to corporate globalization, the media refers to us as anti-globalization activists. So again, what we stand against, at least according to them. But in the Spanish language press, I saw a word recently, altermundistas, which you could sort of translate as alternative worlders. I thought, okay, well, yeah, I'll claim that one. And then also our friends in the Global South and Latin America have a phrase, globalización desde abajo, which means grassroots globalization. And the idea being that if the corporations are trying to impose their vision of globalization from the top down, that we at the grassroots can reach out as individuals and organizations across borders in the joint struggle for social and environmental justice. So in terms of the purpose of the trip was to witness the impact of our tax dollars there in Colombia, and also to provide accompaniment because the people that I was with, the union leaders, the peasant leaders, they've all been threatened with death by the right-wing paramilitaries. And they've requested international accompaniment, the idea being that if there is an international presence there, that the right-wing paramilitaries are less likely to carry through on their threats. And obviously, nobody's going to mistake me for a Colombian. And in terms of just a little bit of brief geography on Colombia, northwestern South America, 440,000 square miles, which makes it about almost exactly 3 times the size of Montana, and 44 million people. There's a lot of natural resources there. So in terms of gold, the largest producer of gold in Latin America, the largest reserves of coal, the 5th largest producer of oil, and has very fertile agricultural land where they're running cattle, and also they've recently started implementing African palm plantations for palm oil. So on the one hand, you have these very rich natural resources, but on the other, there's tremendous poverty there in Colombia. The minimum wage is just $119 per month. The poverty rate is 67%, so 2/3 of the Colombian people are living in poverty. And extreme poverty is 26%, and extreme poverty being people that don't even have the money they need to provide the food that they need. And these statistics are based off of, or actually come from the Colombian government themselves, or itself. In terms of the war in Colombia, that's been going on since 1964. And on the one hand, you have the military and police and their allies, the right-wing paramilitaries, which are grouped together mainly in what's referred to as the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or the AUC. And on the other side, you have the left-wing guerrillas. The larger group is the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and a smaller guerrilla group, the National Army of Liberation, the ELN. And it's really important to sort of keep that in mind, that the military and police and the paramilitaries are on one side. They're very, very closely allied. And in terms of the various groups' involvement in the drug trade, Carlos Castaño, who's the head of the paramilitaries in Colombia, was interviewed a couple of times in July, and he said that the paramilitaries get I think 70% of their funding from drug trafficking, which works out to $20 million each month. In terms of political violence, every day in Colombia, 20 people on average are killed or disappeared for political reasons. And of that, the paramilitaries and the government security forces are responsible for about 85% of those killings and disappearances, and the left-wing guerrillas are responsible for about 15%. There's also on average 1,000 people that are forcibly displaced each day, meaning they have to flee from their communities because of the violence. And right now you have a total of almost 3 million displaced people in Colombia. And in terms of the military-paramilitary ties, just to really drive that point home, a quote from Human Rights Watch came out with a great report a couple of years ago, and part of that read, units of the Colombian military and police continue to work with and tolerate the illegal paramilitary groups responsible for the country's most serious human rights violations. And then Amnesty in December of last year, in a report, stated the paramilitaries continue forming an integral part of the counterinsurgency strategy of the security forces. And both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have repeatedly and extensively documented that very close connection between the paramilitaries and the military. In terms of U.S. involvement in Colombia, it goes way back to even actually before the start of the Civil War in the early 1960s. But that intervention escalated sharply in the summer of 2000 when a thing called Plan Colombia, a special appropriations bill, was pushed through Congress. It included $642 million in military and police aid for Colombia. President Clinton pushed that really hard using the justification of the war on drugs. And at that time, the late Senator Paul Wellstone offered an amendment that would have taken $225 million of military aid and transferred it to domestic drug treatment programs. But unfortunately, both Senators Baucus and Burns voted against that amendment, and the amendment was defeated. So in the last 4 years, we've had the U.S. government give $2 billion to the Colombian military and police. And this year, that included $93 million to create a special infrastructure brigade whose main job is to protect a pipeline, an oil pipeline, jointly owned by Occidental Petroleum and the Colombian National Oil Company, which obviously has nothing to do whatsoever with the war on drugs. And for next year, the administration is requesting that the Colombian military and police get another $553 million. The Foreign Aid Appropriations Bill was voted on in the House in July, and at that time there was an amendment offered by Representatives McGovern and Skelton that would have taken some of that money and reprogrammed it towards global HIV and AIDS programs. And Representative Rieberg voted against that amendment, as did a majority of people in the House, and unfortunately that was defeated. One of the main things that the U.S. is involved with in terms of the so-called war on drugs is fumigation, using the herbicide glyphosate, which is Roundup manufactured by Monsanto. And since December of 2000, just through the first half of this year, 700,000 acres in Colombia had been sprayed. And these next figures are just the land planted with coca, how much acreage, I believe at the end of each of these years. So in 2000, 340,000 acres actually went up during the first year of the fumigations. Went down last year by about 68,000 acres, but also last year 300,000 acres were sprayed. So a lot more land is being sprayed, or a lot of land is being sprayed that's not really under production with coca. And one point I'd like to really emphasize is that drug-related deaths here in the U.S., the latest figure I have was about 17,000 in 1998, and that's from both legal and illegal drugs. And yet each year, 440,000 people die here in the U.S. from smoking-related illnesses. And yet, as far as I'm aware, nobody has yet proposed that we start fumigating North Carolina. Alvaro Uribe is the president of Colombia. He took office in August of last year with a platform of what he refers to as democratic security that involves creating a network of 1 million informants, 15,000 peasant soldiers who would actually be based in their rural communities, which would then drag those rural communities more into the war. A process of negotiations with the right-wing paramilitaries, and human rights workers there in Colombia are very concerned that this could just lead to a process of legalizing the paramilitaries and of impunity for the human rights violations that they've committed. And in fact, there was an article in the New York Times just last week that stated, or last month, that stated, quote, President Uribe is proposing a law that would effectively grant immunity to right-wing death squads that lay down their arms. On the other hand, he's basically proposing total war against the guerrillas, and because there's so much U.S. military aid going down there, he feels no pressure whatsoever to actually sit down and arrive at a negotiated solution to that conflict with the guerrillas. And also, protest has been criminalized there in Colombia. Just through, the end of August of this year, 2,400 peasants, unionists, students, human rights defenders, indigenous people, Afro-Colombians, religious workers, and people in general have been arrested for their activism or just simply for living in suspicious areas. And last month there was a report issued by 80 non-governmental organizations in Colombia about Uribe's first year in office. The title of the report was The Authoritarian Curse, the First Year of Government of Alvaro Uribe Vélez, and stated that his strategies of war and repression have been directed against the civilian population. Shortly thereafter, he had a press conference and he labeled some of those human rights organizations as terrorist spokespersons and human rights traffickers. So now, in addition to trafficking cocaine in Colombia, you can also traffic in human rights. And finally, I just wanted to conclude with a few remarks from our congressional delegation, what they've had or what they've written in letters about the situation in Colombia. Baucus stated, we have continued to secure aid in an attempt to promote stability within the country and the region. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that we have not seen the situation improve and the violence has continued. We must continue to work together and think creatively to ensure that our support is positively impacting the country. And I would encourage you to keep these statements in mind as we're taking a look at the slides. Denny Rieberg wrote, Colombia plays an intricate role in the United States foreign policy. Colombia is waging an ongoing war against the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a Marxist rebel organization. And recently I voted in favor of providing more military assistance to Colombia. I advocate a peaceful approach to the foreign policy of the United States. However, in a post-September 11th world, increased military support is necessary in our fight against terrorism. I just want to point out that this letter, he sent out the same exact letter, word for word, in July of 2002 and September of this year. And this is what Denny Rieberg had to say about paramilitary violence in Colombia. Absolutely nothing. And this is Conrad Burns. I have consistently supported appropriations for Colombia to fight drug traffickers, leftist guerrilla groups, and help improve the economy. The Colombian people have the right to be free from the evils perpetrated by drug lords, left-wing guerrillas, and freelancing military personnel. I want you to know I'll be working to make sure any aid to Colombia is used to benefit the innocent people of the country. So again, encourage you to keep that in mind as we're going through this. And now I need to shut this off and turn the projector on. So let's see if I can do that. Oh, I can get that too. Let's see if I can actually get this to go from up here. And no, I can't. See, okay, yeah, let me just. And I checked this during the break as well. Okay, wait, there we go. Okay. So we'll see how this transition works. Anyway, I accompanied primarily the workers of the Coca-Cola Workers Union there in Colombia. And during the 1990s, 10,000 Coca-Cola workers, or workers in the Coca-Cola bottling plants, were dismissed there in Colombia as part of a drive to reduce labor costs. And whereas before, most of the workers had long-term contracts with the bottling companies and had wages and then some, or had benefits and job security, now 84% of the workers are temporary workers or contractors, and most of whom earn just the minimum wage of $119 per month and have no benefits. Okay. And this is, I guess it's kind of dark, but that's, let's kind of see how this works with the lights. But this was taken from the local paper, and it's one of the paramilitaries there. And managers of the Coca-Cola bottling plants in Colombia maintain very close relations with those right-wing paramilitaries who are threatening and murdering the union activists. This was Isidro Segundo Gil, and he was the president of the union in Carepa. And in October of 1996, Ariosto Mosquera, who is the manager of the plant there in Carepa, stated that he was going to use the paramilitaries to sweep away the union. And on December 5th of that year, paramilitaries came onto the plant grounds and shot and killed Isidro. At that point in time, in addition to being the president of the union, he was also involved in negotiations with the company for a new collective bargaining agreement. 4 days later, the paramilitaries came back onto the plant grounds, rounded up all of the union workers, and gave them until 4 o'clock that afternoon to resign from the union. By the end of the day, 50 workers had signed identical resignation letters, and the union was effectively disbanded there at the plant. And let's see here. How well can you see that? I might be able to try and turn off that other light if you'd be able to see the images a little bit better. Or okay, let's see how this. Is that off?
That's the other one. Oh, well, probably okay.
Okay. Yeah, I guess unfortunately we'll have to be okay because I'm not sure where the technical person is in terms of being able to do anything else with those lights. I'm not sure if anybody might be able to. Okay, great, thanks, Ellie. So this is William Mendoza. He's the president of the union there in Barranca Bermeja. And because of the work that he's been doing, he's been repeatedly threatened by the right-wing paramilitaries. And he also, there was a case brought against the Colombian government in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, or Inter-American Human Rights Commission. And as a result of that case, the Colombian government has had to provide what are referred to as precautionary measures for union activists and other human rights activists like William. And what those precautionary measures include are armed bodyguards and vehicles. Oh, and also William has worked 14 years at the plant and makes like $268 a month is what he's now paid. Okay, great. And William did come here to Montana in April as part of a speaking tour that was organized by the Montana Human Rights Network. Was here for a couple of weeks, and we were able to get him up to Snow Bowl, and he had never seen snow before in his life, and just really loved that. This was something that happened last year. This is an article that came out in the local paper. That's the bottling plant there. And it reads, they, you see, tried to kidnap the daughter of a Colombian unionist. And what happened was on June 18th of last year, at about 2:45 in the afternoon, on the left here, that's Luz, and on the right is Karen. Luz is William's partner, and Karen is their now 5-year-old daughter. Anyway, on June 18th of last year, the two of them were in the downtown plaza there in Barranca Bermeja, and 3 men came up to them. 2 of the guys were just kind of keeping an eye on the plaza, and one of the guys grabbed Karen by the arm and started pulling her away. Luz, for her part, grabbed Karen's other arm and started pulling back and started screaming. At that point, it just so happened that a couple of police arrived there in the main plaza, so the guy let go of Karen's arm. Luz grabbed her, they ran across the street, got in a cab, and got out of there. Shortly thereafter, William got a call on his cell phone from the paramilitaries telling him that he had been very lucky, that their proposal, or what their objective had been, was to kidnap Karen and to kill her. And the paramilitaries also warned William that unless he stopped denouncing Coca-Cola and Coke's alliance with the right-wing paramilitaries, that one of his family members would be killed. And so that's William on the left and Luz on the right. And their routine when they go to bed at night is that William takes his bulletproof vest and his revolver and puts it on his side of the bed, and Luz, for her part, puts the cell phone and the two-way radio on her side of the bed. So if anything happens during the evening, William is to put on the vest, grab the gun, and Luz is to grab either the cell phone or the two-way radio and start calling for help. This is Juan Carlos Galvez, who's the vice president of the union. He used to be the president of the union, and he's also the president of what's called the CUT, the Unified Workers Federation, there in Barranca Bermeja, which works to bring together all of the various union organizations in Colombia. And he's been, even more so than William, threatened for the work that he's doing. He's been threatened in writing, over the phone, and in person, and has been told that unless he quits his job at Coke and also quits the union, that he'll be killed. This is Fabiano, who is one of Juan Carlos's bodyguards, and he's cleaning his mini Uzi, and he was just doing this in the backyard of the union office. And this is Juan Carlos and Fabiano, one of the meetings in front of the bottling plants. And on August 22nd of this year, Fabiano was driving Juan Carlos at home for lunch a little bit after noon, and they came across, there was 2 guys parked on a motorcycle. The person on back drew a gun, pointed at the truck, so Fabiano stopped the truck, and the guy then opened fire. And so Fabiano, for his part, opened up the driver's door, fired back. Juan Carlos's other bodyguard, Alfonso, opened up the other door and fired back, and the 2 guys on the motorcycle took off. And fortunately, nobody was hurt. But they were really concerned about this because Juan Carlos has been getting threatened for quite a while, but this was one of the first times that the paramilitaries have actually tried to follow through on those threats. And this is on July 22nd of this year. There was an international campaign against Coca-Cola that was launched, calling on Coke to stop the repression there in Colombia. And in particular, what the organizations are calling on people to do is to boycott Coca-Cola and also to divest from Coca-Cola stock. And this is another shot of William. On September 9th of this year, Coca-Cola FEMSA, which is Coke's primary bottler in Latin America, announced its plans to close 9 of their 16 bottling plants there in Colombia, including the plant in Barranca Bermeja where William and Juan Carlos work. On that morning, the workers reported to work and were told to go to a hotel. They went there, the management came in, said that the plant was going to be closed, and that the workers had until 4 o'clock that afternoon to arrive at an economic agreement with the plant to resign from their contract, basically like so-called voluntary retirement, that in exchange for a certain amount of money, they would then resign from their contracts. And they were told that if they didn't arrive at one of those agreements, that they would just be dismissed anyway. And since that time, the workers have, for their part, have continued showing up there for work. The production lines have been shut down, so they're not producing there at the plant, but every day the workers are going there, standing at their place on the production line. And they've also installed what they're referring to as, in Spanish, it's carpas de resistencia, which would be like resistance camps in front of all of the Coke's bottling plants there in Colombia. And according to William, the company has offered him $45,000 to resign from his contract. This is a guy who makes $268 a month. That was their initial offer. The last time I talked to him a few weeks ago, the company had upped its offer to $90,000. Obviously thinking if they could get the president of the union to resign from his contract, that everybody else would as well. But as William told me, he said, my conscience is not for sale. And so they're continuing to resist. And I do have to point out, you might have noticed some of the colorful flyers that are posters as you were coming into the room today. The University of Montana last year in December did sign a 7-year exclusive contract with Coca-Cola. It basically gives Coca-Cola a monopoly for the sale of beverage products here on campus. That's why just before our lunch break, I went down to the UC Market, which is not administered by the university, and was able to purchase some non-repressive drinks for people to enjoy during lunchtime. But also the contract enables Coke to use the university's name, teams, logos, and mascots in its advertising. So this is a publication of the Organización Femenina Popular, or the Low-Income Women's Organization, and it reads, for life and with the people, defending rights and constructing a different world. And the OFP it's a gender and class-based organization made up of low-income women. They've got various women's centers there in Barranca Bermeja and in the surrounding communities. They have a lunch program where people can get a very nutritious lunch for about the equivalent of 43 cents. And they have classes, handcrafts, sewing classes. They also have integral healthcare program, and that includes gynecology, counseling, general medicine. They've got legal assistance, and they also have youth groups in terms of dance and drum. This is Yolanda Becerra, who's the director of the OFP. She actually came here to Montana in October of 2001 on a speaking tour, and she has been repeatedly threatened by the right-wing paramilitaries for the work that they're doing. The most recent threat was on May 10th of this year. There was a written threat that came to the Northeastern Women's Center there in Barranca Bermeja, threatening Yolanda. And in early June, they issued a report about the increase of paramilitary violence there in Barranca Bermeja, because right before Christmas of 2000, the right-wing paramilitaries entered Barranca Bermeja in force and now really control the city and particularly dominate the poor neighborhoods in the eastern part of the city. And in that report, the OFP talked about that in Barranca Bermeja and the Magdalena Media, which is the region there, the military, police, and civilian authorities accept the absolute territorial, political, and social domination of the paramilitaries. We, the social organizations, are opposed to the paramilitaries publicly assuming the authority and functions of the government and its institutions. And the report talks about what the paramilitaries are doing, that they're calling neighborhood meetings and town meetings in the areas that they control, bringing all the people together to enforce their conduct manual. They actually have a written conduct manual for the people that live in those areas. And if people violate those rules, they're punished. And some of the punishments are public. They include tying people up, whipping them, shaving their eyebrows and heads. And if the person doesn't correct themselves after going through a couple of those punishments, they're then oftentimes killed. This is Gloria. She's another organizer for the OFP, has been working with them for about 15 years. And in, June 28th of this year, there was a regional human rights forum there in Barranca Bermeja, and Gloria read the report of the OFP at that conference. Just wanted to share some of the words from that. Their report was entitled The Global Fight Against Terrorism, and they wrote, "No one realized that the fall of the towers would be the beginning of the war of the globalizing market. And the powerful are winning the war in telecom, Ecopetrol, the Social Security Institute, and the vocational training services, wherever thousands of workers are being thrown out of their jobs. And all those are either government enterprises or agencies that the government is in the process or wants to privatize. To support the real struggle against terrorism is to oppose death, hunger, the lack of hospitals, and the privatization of government enterprises. And finally, if you stop being obsessed with consuming and only buy what is needed, you will stop supporting their war." This is the Scimitar River. I was invited by the Peasant Association of the Scimitar River Valley to take part in a commission that was verifying the impacts of the fumigations that were going on there. The fumigations that started just 2 weeks before we arrived there. The commission was made up of 24 people representing various non-governmental organizations and also the media. The Scimitar River Valley is about a couple hours west of Barranca Bermeja. There's 80 communities there, about 25,000 people. And the main town centers, the 4 towns outside of the valley, are completely controlled by the paramilitaries who are imposing an economic blockade against those communities. There used to be a system of cooperative tiendas in the communities to keep the price of basic goods within reach of the poor peasants. That system of cooperatives has been destroyed by the paramilitaries, but people do still have little stores, little tiendas in their homes. But for somebody to bring products into the valley, a store owner, they would first have to go to the main town and meet with the local paramilitary commander. In this case, they'd have to go to Yondo, meet with the paramilitary commander. After that meeting, they can then register themselves in the paramilitary's book. Being so registered, they can then buy products at one of the paramilitary stores in that town where they're charged the paramilitary tax. So that way, when they're bringing the products back into the valley, if they get stopped at one of the paramilitary checkpoints, they can then show the receipt showing that they bought it at the paramilitary store, and it has the stamp showing that they paid the paramilitary tax. Even so, there are various goods that are not allowed into the valley. You can't bring in rubber boots, which are very much needed during the rainy season, any kind of canned goods, batteries, or medicines, because supposedly all of those things would just be used by the guerrillas. This is the road leading into the valley, and actually it hadn't rained for a few days before, so the road was in a little bit better shape than it usually is. But even so, one of the vehicles got stuck and had to be pulled out of there. And along the way, even before we hit this spot, there were 2 military checkpoints that we had to pass through. So these military checkpoints not too far outside of Yondo, and yet in the town itself, the paramilitaries freely roam. And just the week before that we traveled on this road, the road had actually been closed for a week, and nobody had been allowed to either go into the valley or leave the valley. And along the way, we were going to the town of Notepasas, and there was this cornfield right off the side of the road that had been fumigated. And you can see, obviously, what had been hit, and then the green that had not been fumigated. Just a close-up of the corn. And this was the field for Julio, and Julio lost 4 acres of coca, but also 6 acres of corn. And this is Julio, and he explained to us, he said that the legal crops aren't worth anything. And he went on to explain that from his few acres of coca that he could clear about $160 every 45 days, which is as often as they could harvest the coca. And also during that time, he would employ between 5 and 6 people for the harvest, and they would make between $17 and $27 for those 5 days of work. In contrast, yucca, which is a root crop that's raised there, he said a good price for a carga of yucca, and a carga is like 250 pounds, a good price for a carga of yucca in Barranca Bermeja, the nearest main city, would be about $14. But just the transportation, when we saw the roads going into the valley, the transportation alone would cost $7, or half of that. And just as the case with Julio, all of the coca that I saw there in Colombia was just grown on small plots of land between like 2 and 8 acres, and the farmers on the rest of their land had it planted with food crops. And Julio's got 3 children, and this is the oldest, Paola, who's 8 years old and in 2nd grade. And this is a coca plant. This was actually about 5 feet tall, very light green in color. It doesn't look at all like corn or plantains, and so the pilots, when they're flying overhead to do the fumigation, can definitely tell what's underneath them, what's coca and what's not. And in terms of the process that's used, well, actually, first off, when you plant coca, you have to wait about 8 months before you can first harvest it. But then after that, you can pick the leaves every 45 to 90 days, and the plants will last for more than 10 years. And some of the ingredients that are used to transform the coca leaves into coca paste are cement, they use bags of dry cement, gasoline, caustic soda, and sulfuric acid. And that's just to process it into coca paste. To then go from coca paste into actual cocaine, there's a whole bunch of other very nasty chemicals that are used. The going price right now for a kilo of coca paste in the countryside is $750. And when I told people how much cocaine goes for here in the U.S., or used to go for at least, anyway, a couple of decades ago, they were just amazed. obviously they're just getting a fraction of this money. And the farmer, from a kilo of coca paste, after they paid for those ingredients, paid for the workers, will wind up with about a net income of $152. And no more than 10% of the profit from cocaine actually stays in Colombia. Most of it is obviously made here in the States and in Europe, where the final sales take place. So from Note Pasas, we went down the Scimitar River to El Bagre and interviewed some of the families there. And unfortunately, this probably is not going to show up with the lights, but this guy and his 16-year-old son had been in their field, and they were fumigated. One of the planes just flew overhead and dropped the glyphosate on top of them. And you might be able to see here this is Jorge Luis. He's 16 years old, and you can see it somewhat on his upper chest, just where the skin had peeled off. And again, the two of them had been fumigated just 2 weeks before we were there. This is Yenli. She's an attorney, and the Peasant Association put together a form that we used to, when we were interviewing the families, it would ask how many acres of food crops, of coca, of forest, and of pasture land had been impacted, if any water sources had been impacted, people, animals, and then on the back side we'd write sort of a brief description of the events in terms of what had taken place during the fumigation. And on the right, this is Iris. She's a member of the Displaced Persons Organization of Barranca Bermeja, one of the people that had to flee from their homes because of the violence, interviewing Flavio. And Flavio lost 10 acres of corn, his yucca plants, his plantains. He said there was some coca, but it was lejísima. It was a long ways off. And altogether, the commission interviewed 45 families during the 3 days in the valley, and found that on average, for every acre of coca that had been sprayed, between 1 and 4 acres of food crops had been fumigated. And also, people and or their children reported suffering after the fumigation from various health impacts, fever, diarrhea, vomiting, headaches, and skin rashes. And the last day of the commission, we actually had a chance to see the fumigation in operation. We first heard the helicopters, because each of the spray planes is accompanied usually by 3 attack helicopters. So we heard the helicopters coming in, and then saw the planes. There were 7 helicopters, 3 planes. The operation went on for about 40 minutes. This plane got within about half a mile of where we were at. And I don't have any shots of it, but we could actually see the white cloud coming down of the glyphosate. And people told us that the valley had initially been sprayed for the first time back twice in 2001. Prior to that, about 40% of the families in the valley were growing coca, so that after the fumigation, that figure actually increased to 80%. And the reason behind that is that it turns out that coca is one of the most resistant plants out there to glyphosate. So if you spray a piece of land, you can go out there the next week and plant it with coca, but you would have to wait several months before you could plant food crops on that same piece of land. So if you've lost your food crops, the quickest way for you to be able to recover economically is to plant coca. And I also want to point out that the corporation that has the contract, the State Department contract for the fumigations, is DINCorp, a U.S. corporation. They contract the pilots for the fumigations. This is Laura, who's a reporter for the Consultancy for Human Rights and Displacement, interviewing Alvaro, who's an organizer for the Peasant Association. And in response to one of her questions, Alvaro said that in the last 3 years, 100 of his friends and acquaintances have been killed. And I met Alvaro last year. I went to the valley for the first time just for a few days. And so I asked him, well, how are things this year as compared to last year? And he said that the situation has gotten worse. The paramilitaries are coming further into the valley, and then talked about the previous week that the road had been closed going into the valley, and also the fumigations, which he described as the war of hunger and contamination. And the Peasant Association does have some various projects there in the valley. They're working to construct 30 homes, and this is Puerto Matilde, which is the main town in the valley. But there's a problem with the projects in terms of bringing the cement into the valley. Last year they had a truck loaded up with 450 bags of cement, was leaving Yondo, got stopped at one of the paramilitary checkpoints, and the paramilitaries were demanding that they pay a tax for each bag of cement. So the truck got turned back, went back to Yondo, was parked for a week at a gas station there just 100 yards from the police station. Neither the police nor the military, which has a military base in Yondo, did anything about that. The Peasant Association had to negotiate with the paramilitaries and finally wound up paying a tax of $1.07 per bag to bring the cement into the valley. Right now, the Peasant Association has about 2,500 bags of cement there in Yondo, and the paramilitaries have since increased the tax. It's now gone up to $1.79 per bag. This is, the association also has a few productive projects, and what the association is proposing for its part is the gradual and manual eradication of coca, accompanied by alternative crops that would enable the people to be able to provide for their families. And so they've got this is sugar, and they're also working to bring 3 sugar mills into the valley, but they've got a problem with that. Again, because of the economic blockade, they haven't been able to bring in the parts for the sugar mills or the bricks that they would be needed to construct the mills. They've got 150 water buffalo there, which is another one of their projects. This is the main ranch for the buffalo project. And one of the young women that lives there. And the day of the fumigation, that afternoon, the commission, most of the commission left to go back to Barranca Bermeja. A few of us stayed on for a few more days. That afternoon, the military came into San Francisco, about half an hour away. And we had initially been planning on going to another region a little bit further north to verify the impacts of the fumigation there. But that evening, there was a meeting of the people in Puerto Matilde, and they asked us to stay there with them because they were very concerned about this military incursion into the valley. So we stayed there with them rather than going further on and verifying the impacts in that other area. And I did have a chance as well to get back to Medellin, which I visited for the first time last year. It's a city of about 2 million people, and it's a city of just amazing contrast. That it sits in a valley, and downtown is, there's these big skyscrapers. You've got outdoor artworks. There's a real fancy metro system, very opulent shopping malls. But then up on the hillsides, that's where the poor folks live. And there's a lot of displaced people there in Medellin. It's the capital of the department of Antioquia, which is one of the hardest hit departments in Colombia. And so you've got a lot of displaced people that are coming into the city. And this is my friend Gudrun, and I always have to point out that she actually does not wear an image of herself on her shirt. I took this last year. It was towards the end of the roll of film. The film was sticking, and so it was a little bit of a double exposure there. But she's from Germany. She's an agronomist, has been there in Colombia for the last few years. And I met her when I was there in Colombia for the first time 2 years ago, accompanying a peasant organization that she was working with. And she's now there in Medellin working with some of the displaced communities and also some of the communities in the eastern part of Antioquia. And this is, there's 5 communities that have come together in northeastern Antioquia, and they formed what they're calling a settlement of internal refugees for peace and human rights. And the reason they've chosen the word refugees, they haven't crossed any national borders, but they view themselves as being politically persecuted for their status as displaced people. So they're claiming the term or the title of displaced. And in terms of the peace part of it, they issued a declaration on February 14th when they established the settlement, and said that peace is a fundamental and inalienable, I always have trouble with that word, anyway, that word, right of all human beings. But we don't want a symbolic peace of doves and white shirts, nor much less a silence accompanied by famine, exile, exclusion, submission, and a slow, humiliating death. The peace in which we, the displaced, believe in and are dreaming of is a real peace with a human face, a peace with dignified work, with health, with education, a promising future for our children and the future generations, in which human rights are integrally respected and fulfilled. And this is the community of Bello Oriente, downtown Medellin in the background. I went there with Carlos, who's an agronomist. It took us maybe just about half an hour on a bus to work our way up from downtown Medellin. But there in Bello Oriente, we were definitely in another world. And some of the housing there. And there's a women's vegetable garden. The people there are peasants that have been displaced from the countryside. They're trying to maintain their peasant culture. On the left, this is Miguel Angel, who's 2, and Lina Marcela, who's 3. And during the time that I was in Medellin, the week that I was there, I wasn't able to take photos of any adults with the exception of Gudrun just because of security concerns. So I was just able to take photos of some of the kids. And after I took this photo, we had a meeting with the leaders of the community. And while we were having that meeting in the house here, the 5 soldiers came into the community and went directly to the house where we were meeting at. and they asked, well, who's coordinating the meeting? We need to speak to that person. So Carlos stepped out, and I went out immediately after him. And the soldiers were fairly well behaved, but it was still just very troubling to have them come into the community and go directly to where we were meeting at. And the next day, I went with Gudrun to the community of La Honda, which is also one of the settlements. And you can maybe see in the center of the picture, there's kind of a little bit of red kind of coming up the road there. And the day that we came into the community, Gudrun and I were walking up the road. We got off of the bus a little bit further down. Coming up, we just come around that bend, and right behind us, a police truck came up, and it came up around the bend, and when it saw us, it put on the brakes fairly suddenly and wound up backing down the road. And when we actually then got into the community, we went to the school. There was a young person there, Jorge. We talked to him, and he said that 2 days before, the police had come into the community and had taken he and 7 other people from the community down to the San Blas police station in Medellin. He said while he was there, he counted a total of 50 young people from the various communities in northeastern Medellin that were there. They were all photographed, their information was taken down, and then they were released, but they were released at 9 o'clock at night, which meant they had to come back up those hills, which are those neighborhoods controlled by the paramilitaries at night, to be able to get back to their community. The day before we were here, the police came back once again and went to the bus stop, just sort of down around the bend there, and took the owners of those small stores down to the police station. The next day I came back with a couple of lay Franciscans who were doing cultural work there in the community, and as we were coming in, there was we stopped inside a little tienda, and while we were inside there, this police truck came by. And so we stepped out right after that, and I saw as the police truck turned and went down to this house that in the back of the cab there was a hooded informant. There was this guy sitting back there, had on an olive green ski mask. And I'd heard of the encapuchados, but this was the first time we'd actually seen that I had actually seen that. And about 45 minutes later, the truck left this house, stopped at another place, and left the community, and took away another 7 young people from the community. So I finally did have, a couple of weeks later, was able to get back to the region we had initially planned to go to verify the impacts of the fumigation there in the southern part of the Department of Bolivar. So we took a boat to San Pablo, about an hour north of Barranca Bermeja on the Magdalena River. From there, got on a truck, once again, the fine roads in the countryside. The Toyota Land Cruiser, 4-wheel drive, it got stuck, had to be pulled out. And also that day there was fumigations going on, and this time there were, 6 helicopters and 2 planes that we saw, and while we were stuck here in the mud, 3 helicopters flew almost directly overhead. And I found myself thinking about all of, how many millions of our tax dollars were represented in those helicopters that were flying overhead, but obviously we haven't invested a whole lot of our tax dollars in improving the roads. This is the town of Alto San Juan, and the situation here is very similar to the Scimitar River Valley. There's also an economic blockade against this region. Again, people are not allowed to bring in rubber boots, batteries, canned goods, or medicines. And the day after that we arrived here, the military came up to the town of Cerro Azul, about half an hour away. This is Manuel, who I spent the next week with. He's a leader of the Peasant Association. So for the next week, we traveled by foot and mule just through the southern part of Bolivar, going to different farms that had been fumigated. Manuel is originally from Urabá, up on the Caribbean coast. He had to flee from the violence there, went to Cartagena. While he was there in Cartagena one day, he was with another person. They were attacked by the paramilitaries. Fortunately, Manuel was able to escape, but his friend was killed. Manuel then went to Bucaramanga, started working with the displaced persons there, and after receiving 4 written death threats from the paramilitaries, decided it was time to leave the city and to go to the southern part of Bolivar. This is Omar on the left and his wife Fanny, and their place had been fumigated on, it was like May 30th, just the month before that we were there. And Fanny said that when she heard the plane that day, she said, "I dropped to my knees and I prayed to God to spare our food crops." And they said that after the place had been sprayed, that it looked like a desert. And Fanny also said, "Why do they need more aircraft?" And point out that the cost of a helicopter, that money could be used for schools, health centers, and roads. And this is their 2 sons, Omar, who's 11, and Arby, who's 3. And the day of the fumigations, they and Fanny were inside their house when the plane flew overhead and dropped the glyphosate. Their house just has a thatched roof, as does most of the houses there in that region. And 4 days later, all 3 of them came down with fever and headaches. And this is their land. Unfortunately, you can't really see it that well because of the lighting, but it really did. It looked just like a desert. I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. This is their house. And again, this was about a month after it had been fumigated. And this was their neighbor's place just across the way. And so they lost, let's see, 5 acres of coca, 4 acres of plantains, 2.5 acres of pasture land, 1 acre of yucca, 24 avocado trees, and their vegetable garden. And this is their plantains. Just going to go through these a little bit quicker just to get to the next piece here. So after spending time in Alto San Juan, we then went to Alto Cañaveral, which had also been fumigated in May 24th, about a month before we were there. And then just the week before we were there, the military arrived in Alto Cañaveral, and this time they came in via helicopter. And what they did is they first bombed out the outskirts of the community, and then had the troops came off of the helicopters. While they were there, they started the fumigations again. So this area had been fumigated twice in the course of just 6 weeks. And this is just to give you an idea of the countryside there. It's just a really beautiful area. And actually, the Peasant Association got approved by the Colombian government after a long struggle that part of this area is now a peasant reserve zone. And there is some timber that's being cut there, but it's being done very sustainably, just hauled out on mules. And some of the areas is just left completely off limits, that nobody can go into that area. And so they're preserving that piece of ground. This is the water system for the town of Alto Cañaveral, and on May 24th, there's a little stream that feeds into this tank, and that stream was fumigated. So they actually had to shut down the water system for the community. This is the Foursquare Evangelical Church in Alto Cañaveral, and the reason for that slide is that this is the cornfield of the evangelicals, which had also been fumigated at the end of May. The evangelicals definitely do not have any coca that they're growing there, nor is there any coca anywhere nearby there. But we actually did talk to Herman, one of the leaders of the evangelicals, and he said that we don't have coca, but we live from it. And just to explain that coca is basically the only cash crop in those very remote rural communities. And it's the money from coca that then circulates through the local economy that enables people to buy the bread that he and his family bake. This is Melba Rosa on the right and her daughter Levis Marcela, who's 1.5 years old. Their place was fumigated on July 1st, just the week before we were there. And she had 6 acres of coca, 2.5 acres of corn, 1 acre of pasture, and also there are 3 springs on her land, and all 3 of those were fumigated. And Levis Marcela, for her part, right after the fumigation, came down with fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. And finally, this was the house of Paulina. And when the military came into Alto Cañaveral on June 30th, they came to Paulina's house 9 o'clock that night and burned it to the ground. This used to be a 4-room house. The only thing that was left was the concrete floor. So all of the things inside, the beds, the clothes, the children's toys, that was all destroyed in the fire. 2 years before, the house had also been burned down, that time by the paramilitaries, and also at that point in time, the paramilitaries raped and killed the young woman Lucero who was there. And this is Paulina and her young son Harold Jeffrey, who's 3 years old. And just to conclude, I want to show some shots of Barranca Bermeja and some of the things that were happening there. This is the main refinery for the Colombian Petroleum Company. And oil was discovered there in the region in 1905. The Tropical Oil Corporation, a U.S. corporation, began operations there in 1919. The city of Barranca Bermeja itself was founded in 1922, and the following year, the USO, the National Petroleum Workers Union, was founded, and they struggled for 3 decades to finally get the refinery privatized, and so it's now the national, or the Colombian Petroleum Company, owned by the Colombian government. And it produces more than 80% of the gasoline consumed in Colombia. There's about 7,000 people that work at Ecopetrol, and it provides the government with revenues of about more than $2 billion every year, most of which goes to health care and education. And just real briefly, in terms of Barranca Bermeja, it's got an incredible history of resistance going back to the indigenous resistance against the Spanish invader, Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, who showed up there in 1536. And then years later, in the 1970s, most of the poor neighborhoods in Barranca Bermeja were formed by land takeovers. The people would get together, organize themselves, go out, occupy vacant pieces of land, construct their houses, and they've been there ever since. And they maintained their organization and pushed on the government to get roads, water, sewer, electricity, schools, clinics, what have you. So it's got this amazing history of resistance. This is the refinery there, and the Colombian government had given President Uribe special emergency powers to restructure government enterprises, and one of the things that he had done was on June 12th, he had liquidated Telecom, the Colombian telecommunications company, as a first step towards privatizing it. And then on June 20th, the government ordered the military to take over the refinery there in Barranca Bermeja. That evening, around 10 o'clock, the soldiers showed up at the refinery. They kicked out the people from the swing shift, and they forcibly locked out the union workers from the night shift. So the union, the other social organizations there in Barranca were very concerned about this, that this would be the first step towards actually privatizing Ecopetrol. So there was a whole series of activities that were organized in response. And the first one was on June 24th, the Diocese of Barranca Bermeja organized a mass, a vigil in front of the plant gates at 6 o'clock that morning. This is Father Eliezer. And that mass was, or the vigil was attended by more than 1,000 people. And then that afternoon there was a caravan that went throughout the city talking about, to let people know what was happening at the refinery and urging people to come out the next day for a massive march. And one of the most brilliant things about this caravan was that it went into the poor neighborhoods in the eastern part of Barranca Bermeja that have been completely controlled by the paramilitaries. So this was the first time that anything like that had happened since the paramilitaries took over those areas in December of 2000. So there were like 3,000 people that took part in the caravan, hundreds of these mopeds, which are the main form of transportation there in Barranca. And then the next day there was the march that left from the refinery, went past Telecom, the telecommunications company, the Social Security Institute, which the government plans to privatize, and also the National Vocational Training Service, which the government is planning to privatize as well. And this is a reporter from El Tiempo, one of the main Colombian national papers. And all these activities were mainly organized by the diocese, the Union, the CUT, which is the Unified Workers Federation, and also the OFP, the Low Income Women's Organization. The banner reads, "We support the USO, the National Petroleum Workers Union, no to the privatization of Ecopetrol." And finished up with a large concentration in front of the national office of the union. So that was on June 25th. And then on June 26th, that morning when I got up and went out into the left of the union office, the next block over there were about 24 police dressed just like this with their shields and helmets out. There was also a tank on the street. And that evening, over the news, the government announced that they had issued 2 decrees to restructure Ecopetrol. And the first was to create the National Hydrocarbon Agency, which will now be responsible for issuing contracts for the exploration and exploitation of Colombia's petroleum reserves. Previously, Ecopetrol had that responsibility. So basically, they took away the most valuable part of the company. And the other thing they did is they changed the name and the structure of the company. It went from being Ecopetrol to Ecopetrol S.A., Sociedad Anónima. So it's now basically Ecopetrol Incorporated. So it's now going to be a stock-owned company. According to the government, that all the stock is going to be owned by the government. But it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because the government owned Ecopetrol to begin with. So why would you need to issue stock unless you were planning on privatizing that at some point in time? And supposedly now, this will enable Ecopetrol to compete with the multinational oil corporations. I don't know if you remember from that first slide, all that black smoke going up into the air, that the government has not invested a whole lot of money in modernizing that refinery for quite some time. So to think that Ecopetrol somehow is going to be able to compete with Chevron, Texaco, ExxonMobil, what have you, very difficult. And lastly, on July 24th, the last day that I was there in Barranca, there was a Jornada Cívica, a day of civil resistance that was organized. And so what people did is there were 5 points of concentration in various parts of the city. And there were different organizations had responsibility for the different points of concentration. This one was the responsibility of the OFP, the Low Income Women's Organization. This was a very symbolic place there in Barranca Bermeja. It's called the Elevated Bridge. The other side of this bridge begins the northeastern part of Barranca Bermeja, the poor neighborhoods that are controlled by the paramilitaries. So this was kind of a way of taking back that territory from the paramilitaries. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then every 2 hours after that, for half an hour, the people would go out and take over the streets and just shut it down. And, no traffic going or coming, and that was part of the day's activities. And they had the women of the OFP there. The one sign reads, "We the women do not give birth nor raise daughters and sons for the war." And they had the dance group of the OFP. This was the banner of the workers' pastorate of the Diocese of Barrancabermeja. It reads, "Solidarity, participation, and organization are the liberating force of the working people." And then at the end of the day, there was this march that left from the union office and went down to the refinery. This is the banner of the USO, the National Petroleum Workers Union. And the OFP, the Low Income Women's Organization, again, right in the heart of things. And it was a torchlit march, which was just a brilliant symbol. They wanted to be able to have some kind of symbol to carry with them. They decided to have these torches, which for Barrancabermeja is perfect because at any point in time there's usually like 6 or 7 flares that are going off at the refinery. And so they carried these torches through town. And it was just this huge march. There were like over 10,000 people that took to the streets up at Barrancabermeja, went from the national office down to the entrance to the refinery. And along the way, I saw William and was able to march the last part of the way with him, and he was just ecstatic to see this many people on the streets there in Barrancabermeja. Again, the city is pretty much dominated by the paramilitaries, but over 10,000 people took to the streets, and he said, "This is why I don't leave." He's had offers to be able to go into political asylum in other countries, but he's like, this is why I don't leave. There's no place else that's like Barrancabermeja. And at the end of the march, there were just 2 people that spoke. Yolanda Becerra, the head of the Low Income Women's Organization, was one of them. And she said, "Those that thought they could silence us through violence were mistaken. We're Barranqueños y Barranqueñas, we're people of Barrancabermeja. We have resistance running in our veins." And so that's the image I wanted to finish off with. And leave you with that, just the incredible resistance of the people there in Barrancabermeja who are standing up to that situation. And just before we open up for any questions, I want to point out just a few things that you can do. We've got on the table out there is a little fact sheet about Coca-Cola in Colombia, their practices there, and we've created Community Action for Justice in the Americas, a website that you can go to and very quickly and easily send an email message to the Coca-Cola company expressing your concern for the closure of the plants in Colombia, and another one where you can let the Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Montana know that you're boycotting Coca-Cola products because of Coke's practices in Colombia and the exclusive contract here at the university. And we also have letters out there directed to Senators Baucus and Burns calling on them to vote against any additional funding for the Colombian military and for the fumigations, because the Foreign Aid Appropriations Bill will be voted on sometime in the Senate here soon. And what you can do is just sign those letters, leave them on the table, we'll gather them all up together and then present them to their offices. So that's it for that, and let me just turn on the lights here. For all intents and purposes, that's the way that I look at it. Because of that very close relationship between the Colombian military and police and the paramilitaries, we're essentially funding the paramilitaries, right?
And the drug dealers are also funding the paramilitary because they'd like to have these spraying things go on, which wind up growing more cocaine, right?
Well, how the drug traffickers get involved in all this is they helped to deform the paramilitaries initially back in the 1980s. The left-wing guerrillas were operating in the countryside, and sometimes they were operating in areas where the drug traffickers had their places. There was some kidnapping going on, what have you. So the drug traffickers basically helped form the paramilitaries as a way of fighting against the guerrillas. But anyway, all that to say, the paramilitaries very definitely are supported by the drug traffickers. You're right on that.
So the U.S. government and the drug people are funding the paramilitary activity.
Yeah.
Okay. I just that.
In order
Thank you.
Just to clarify, in order to establish corporate America down there and take advantage of the poor labor force. I mean, I'm not.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, that pretty much would be it. The way the folks in the Scimitar River Valley and the southern part of Bolivar, the way they expressed it to me was that the large landowners are supporting the paramilitaries because they want the paramilitaries to go in there and just, push the peasants off the land so that the large landowners can take over that land for their cattle operations or put in these African palm plantations. And also it does tie in with the corporate interest because the paramilitaries definitely go after the union activists like William, Juan Carlos, and what have you, just view them as guerrilla sympathizers. So they're also involved in just really making things very difficult for the unions, which then enables the corporations to have more temporary workers and workers that just accept the minimum wage.
In terms of tax, is that just money for the right-wingers to stick in their pockets and do what they want with? I mean, is that this is the way I make my money now, this is the way I feed my family on the right for these paramilitary people?
I think, my limited understanding is that's one of the sources of financing for the paramilitaries is that tax that they charge at their stores. But I think that, as Carlos Castaño admitted, they get a lot more of their money just directly from drug trafficking. Again, according to him, they get like 70% of their funding from drug trafficking. And that's one of the other things that I've heard. I don't have a lot of hard data for that, but a lot of people have said that the fumigations are primarily going on in areas where there's a presence of the left-wing guerrillas, not so much fumigation going on in areas where there's a strong presence of the paramilitaries.
Okay.
Do you know what the long-term effects of the glyphosate are? And the second question is, do we know how many of either the government or paramilitary are being trained at whatever the new name of the schools of America is?
Yeah. In terms of the long-term effects of glyphosate, I honestly don't know myself. There was a case brought against the Colombian government calling on them to do a scientific study of the human and environmental impacts of the glyphosate and the concentrations of that being used in Colombia. And there was a court in Bogota that found in favor of the people that had brought that suit, ordering the government to carry out those studies. The government, for its part, and that decision was made, I think, on June 26th. The government said it was going to appeal that decision, and while the decision is on appeal, they're going to continue with the fumigations. In terms of the paramilitaries or military being trained at the School of the Americas, which a couple of years ago was renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, and has trained more than 60,000 Latin American soldiers and officers since the late 1940s. More soldiers from Colombia have gone through the school than soldiers of any other country in Latin America. I think there's more than 11,000 Colombian soldiers that have trained at the School of the Americas, a number of whom have then been connected with the paramilitaries there in Colombia.
Well, I wanted to clarify and understand something better. Compared to what somebody was just saying, my understanding is the U.S. government has been supporting the Colombian government for basically two purposes: the war on drugs, whether it works or not doesn't matter, and also to try to counter the extreme leftists. Right? It really has nothing to do, or very little to do with support of economic interests. Is that correct? I mean, it's basically those two reasons is what Congress votes on. Because of war on drugs and war against the extreme left.
Well, those are definitely the stated justifications that are given for U.S. involvement there, but I think that it's got a lot to do with economic interest. There are, again, the natural resources there, oil, coal,
well, that
gold.
would imply then that somebody's influencing our Congress on a specific country.
Yeah.
Like which one? Like which ones? I mean, if you're going to say that.
Well, I think it's, I think in general, it's an ongoing pattern in terms of U.S. foreign policy, certainly throughout Latin America for a number of decades now, in terms of protecting the interests of the wealthy few in those countries, which also benefits the interests of U.S. corporations that are operating there. In terms of some of the corporations operating there, you've got, again, the Coca-Cola Company, Drummond Coal Company, based out of Alabama. There's been a lawsuit filed against them for the murder of union activists there. Chevron Texaco has got the concession for natural gas up in the northeastern part of Colombia. Occidental Petroleum, Shell has been advising Ecopetrol, and I believe that ExxonMobil as well, just to name a few. And then in terms of the intervention, you've got United Technologies, which makes the Blackhawk helicopters, and Textron, which makes the Huey helicopters. They're getting hundreds of millions of dollars for the helicopters that are being sold there. Monsanto's doing very well for itself in terms of selling the glyphosate. And you've got DynCorp, which has the contract to do the spraying. So they're all doing pretty well, just to name a few of the corporations that are active there.
But the primary things that say, for example, influence focus of the Montana delegation would be the other two factors, the war on drugs and the political concepts of it.
Well, again, that's the stated justification that's given, although even in terms of the war on drugs, as I mentioned, when Plan Colombia was initially passed 3 years ago, the late Senator Wellstone offered an amendment that would have taken $225 million of that and reprogrammed it to drug treatment programs here at home. So if, let's give Congress the benefit of the doubt just for a second here, and say that Congress genuinely is concerned about the problem of cocaine consumption here in the U.S., it would be a lot more effective to spend money on drug treatment programs here in the U.S., because as long as there's demand for cocaine, coke is going to be growing someplace. And even the Rand Corporation, which is far from a liberal organization, did a study back in 1994 and determined that spending money on drug treatment programs here in the U.S. is 23 times more effective than what they refer to as source country eradication, what we're trying to do there in Colombia. But it's an easy way for, and actually I talked to an aide to Senator Baucus a couple of years ago, and she justified his vote on that, saying that he wanted to look tough on drugs, and that's why he voted against that amendment. But I think that there is economic stuff involved there as well. I think it'd be very interesting for somebody to take a look at, of the $6 million or whatever it was that Baucus got for his last run for the Senate, how much of that came from the corporations and how much of that came from people here in Montana.
I didn't know if you tried to do a big project to do the analysis. Those companies you cited,
Yeah, I haven't done that yet myself, but it'd be a really interesting thing to look into a little bit further. Yeah.
What happened to that super fungus that the government paid MSU Bozeman to make this highly toxic fungus that could spray on the coca leaves, and it was so toxic they couldn't test it because they were afraid it'd wipe out all the crops in Montana?
Yeah, it was oxysporum or something. Anyway, there was this fungus that they were testing, and they were referring to it as Agent Green, and they were looking at releasing that in Colombia as a way of going after the coca, but there wasn't any real guarantees that would be the only thing that would go after. And so my understanding is I think that they finally decided not to release that at this point in time.
Well, fumigation is what you do to get rid of unwanted insects. Now, this is a case of poisoning, like defoliation that they did in Vietnam. Is this a Agent Orange type of a compound they're pushing?
I don't know that it's got all the same. I mean, I don't know that much about the whole toxicology of all this stuff. Yeah,
Super Roundup.
Yeah, so just like it's a very heavy-duty herbicide, and they're not. I didn't see just large areas of defoliation and trying to remove the cover from the gorillas and stuff like that. But there definitely are. I mean, just judging from the people that we talked to, from what you saw with Jorge Luis, there's definitely health consequences that are involved. And one of the things that I found myself thinking about while I was there was in July of this year. So that was 3 or 4 months after Bush launched his war against Iraq. We still hadn't found any evidence of weapons of mass destruction. But yet I talked to 24 different families there in the countryside. We went to 12 different farms and saw the impact of this stuff. And from my standpoint, that's very definitely chemical warfare that's going on there in Colombia. And we definitely should stop that before we're pointing the finger at anybody else for what they might or might not be doing.
I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, and maybe you can straighten me out on that, but I understand that, well, I guess there's two things. Number one, are they trying to privatize this oil thing so that Texaco and Exxon, can finally get their hands on it? I don't understand why they're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, it seems like I heard somewhere along the line that this whole spraying thing is going on in order to, there's some kind of laws in Colombia that if you can displace the native people, as long as the native people are there, then they have control over, or if you can displace them, then all of a sudden these companies for a certain number of months, then they lose their rights to the land, and so using this chemical is a great way to displace people because now they can't grow food. Is there any truth to that?
I don't honestly know, and unfortunately I don't know as much about the situation of the indigenous people there in Colombia as I should or as I would like to. I've heard something similar to that, but I don't have any more real details on it. In terms of the whole oil thing, that was certainly the concern of the union and the other social organizations there in Barrancabermeja. This is like a first step towards privatizing the Colombian National Oil Company. And again, if the government owned the company before, why would you need to convert it into a stock-owned company unless at some point in time you're planning on having that stock be sold? And also the fact that they took away from Ecopetrol the power to be able to, in terms of granting the contracts for the exploration and exploitation of Colombia's resources. And that's now going to be this government agency that'll be staffed by, it says right in the law, it'll be staffed by no more than 70 people. And they're supposed to be responsible for all of Colombia's petroleum reserves. And also what we heard time and again there from the union was that the government is not invested in that plant in Barrancabermeja. We definitely, you could see that with the stuff going up in the air there. So how they can possibly compete against those companies, it just seems like the only way it makes any sense to me is that at some point in time that it is going to be sold off to the multinational oil corporations.
If any, what is the guerrilla involvement in the drug trade?
Let's see, the guerrillas, the FARC for their part, they do tax the coca growers. Like so every time that somebody harvests their coca, they do have to pay a tax to the guerrillas. It's maybe, I can't remember exactly on the figures on that in terms of how much per, so it works out to about like $18 per hectare, and a hectare would be about 2.5 acres. And they also tax the buyers that come into those areas to buy the coca paste. So they're charged a certain tax, like per kilo of coca paste. So the FARC, for its part, is getting some of their revenue from the drug trade as well. I'm not aware of them being involved in actual trafficking beyond that. But certainly with these taxes, they are benefiting from the drug trade themselves. And I think that now the smaller the two guerrilla groups who before was pushing people not to grow coca, in some areas they're taxing the producers and the buyers as well.
So in general, where does the peasants support the paramilitary or the guerrillas?
Well, the peasants don't really support either, and they certainly don't support the paramilitaries because a lot of the peasants have been on the receiving end of that paramilitary violence. And I think that some of the peasants, and it's really difficult to get somebody's opinion because the situation is so dangerous there that you can't just really ask, so what do you think of the guerrillas? But just based on some of the conversations that I had with people, I could kind of get a sense that some of them were somewhat supportive of the guerrillas, but I certainly didn't meet anybody in the countryside that was supportive of the paramilitaries. And basically the peasants for their part just want to be left alone and just allowed to grow their crops. And in terms of their involvement with the cocaine business, the people that I met with were really clear. They would just as soon be growing something else. I mean, they don't like the fact that they're involved in the cocaine business themselves. But at this point in time, in those remote rural areas, that's the only cash crop that's out there. So in terms of for them to be able to provide for their families, until there's some kind of alternative, they don't have any choice. Although they said that they would be more than happy to rip out their coca plants if they were to provide alternatives that would enable them to provide for their families.
I just want to cut one more question
I
because
just
we're
had
about to use this room for our general assembly. Go ahead.
I just had a comment the audience might be interested in. I'm a physician, and I just read last month in, believe it or not, the Journal of American Medical Association. They did a study in Los Angeles among the Latin American community, among the community clinics, and they did a survey about political violence. They found among the immigrants that they were seeing at these clinics that 7 to 8% had suffered some kind of political violence. And the number that stuck in my mind was over 50% of these people had suffered direct political torture at the hands of possibly some of these paramilitary groups. And with the large numbers we're seeing being trained through our tax dollars at the, I can't remember the new name of the Schools of the America, I think that's another way it's kind of coming home to us. So if you can imagine 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 people that are now coming to this country have suffered from this kind of political violence, and that's one reason they left their own countries. You can see the impact on their country and the community also.
I'd like to thank you very much. ask questions of him for a day, I'm sure. I know I have a number of questions to ask him. And I'm sorry to have to cut this off. It's just trying to stay on schedule. I want to encourage each of you, if you're not a member of the Montana Human Rights Network, to become a member and help finance this kind of work. We have an organization here in Missoula, but there's probably an organization close to your hometown as well. We're going to have a general assembly in this room, a conference closing, and I imagine that's going to be a very religious, spiritual experience, as it usually is at the Montana Human Rights Network. We may come from a variety of faiths, but we're deeply spiritual. Okay. Thank you.
And I know some people decided that it was a good time just to call it a day and walk away from here. But one of the things we were very happy to do with this conference was to highlight the particular skills and abilities of our own staff. 3 of the 4 workshops were conducted by the staff of the Montana Human Rights Network, and I think it shows a lot about how this organization has matured over the last decade, 12 years now since we've been in existence, that we now have staff that are pretty much highlight our conference. But in addition to that, to have the caliber of national speaker that we have with Daniel Levitas, and one of the people most inspirational at the founding of the Human Rights Network, that helped us tie all these various movements and ideas together in a way that made sense for Montana. And so that's what we tried to do again with our conference this year on the theme of terrorism, and how the various issues and movements are connected on that particular issue. And so I thought it was quite successfully done with the various themes that we have. And I do want to thank the people who primarily planned this conference. In case you didn't know, both Ken and I, the co-directors of this organization, have been gone the last 10 days in New York. And our staff, and particularly our board members, were instrumental in pulling this off. And I wanted to particularly mention Ellie Greenwood. Ellie, would you just stand up? She's also she's also the contact for our local group here in Missoula. So for those of you who are from Missoula and want to become more involved in these kinds of issues in your community, I hope you'll take time to give Ellie your name and email address, and so she can be in touch with you. The other board member to specifically recognize is Kathy Billy, who is out in the hall. Let's give Kathy a hand. Kathy's right here at the door as you leave. Okay. Kathy has been with the organization almost, I believe, since its founding. I don't know if she was on the very first board of directors, but very close to the first, and has been with us over the entire decade. I would be happy for anybody here that just has a few comments that you might want to make about either what you learned today, something new that you thought about today, something new you're taking home with you. If there's anybody here that would like to do that. Kind of a long day for folks. Yes?
Betty gave us a suggestion in her presentation, and that was that principals never hear from people who are satisfied with what's going on in the school. So please go back to, if you have a gay straight alliance in the school, in your community, and call that principal and commend them, and call the school board, the superintendent, or whatever, and commend them on that organization, because that's the way those kind of organizations are going to continue successfully, because otherwise all we hear from are people who are upset about these kinds of groups. So
Thank you.
Give them a phone call.
Thank you. Any other impressions from other workshops that, or from the day as a whole? Anybody wants to say? Ken?
Just glad we didn't have a lot of hugging.
Well, we haven't got to the final activity yet, Ken.
Make your break for the door.
Well, I want to thank you all for attending the event, and this was a good event. We used to always have our annual conference in Great Falls, and then for a period of time we moved it around the state, and in a way we felt like we lost something when we started doing that, because you kind of build a constituency in the community, and I believe we made the decision that for at least 3 years it's going to be in Missoula. This is the first of those years, and maybe it'll find a home here, I don't know. on how active our local group wants to continue to be in helping to plan it here in Missoula. But we hope you'll look for it again next year and to attend if you can. I want to also say that in the newsletters out on the table, there is a form you can fill out if you would like to become a member of the Human Rights Network. For a small annual fee, you get some high-quality newsletters, and in between more substantial newsletters, we have news flashes, we have announcements of programs that we have in your communities. We bring in a number of speakers throughout the year that our local groups then help us sponsor in communities across the state. You'll receive notification of when those events are coming to your community, and also just the pride and the sense of belonging to the best, hottest organization here in the state of Montana doing work on building a progressive future for this state. Finally, Ken, you need to take a stand right here at the door as people go out, and then I invite you all to give him a hug. So, thank you very much.